The beavers' engineering. Realizing that the supply of aspens near the waters of the moraine colony close to my home was almost exhausted, I wondered whether it would be possible for the beavers to procure a sufficient supply downstream, or whether they would deem it best to abandon this old colony and migrate. Out on the plains, where cottonwoods were scarce, the beavers first cut those close to the colony, then harvested those upstream, sometimes going a mile for them, then those downstream, but rarely were the latter brought more than a quarter of a mile. If enemies did not keep down the population of a colony so situated, it was only a question of time until the scarcity of the food supply compelled the colonists to move, either up or downstream, and start anew in a place where food trees could be obtained, but not a move until necessity drove them. Not far from my home in the mountains, the inhabitants of two old beaver colonies endured hardships in order to remain in the old place. One colony, in order to reach a grove of aspens, dug a canal 334 feet long, which had an average depth of 15 inches and a width of 26 inches. It ended in a grove of aspens, which were in due time cut down and floated through this canal into the pond alongside the beaver house. The other colony endured dangers and greater hardships. During the summer of 1900, an extensive forest fire on the northerly slope of Long's Peak brought great hardship among beaver colonies along the streams in the fire district. This fire destroyed all the aspens and some of the willows. In order to have food while a new growth of aspens was developing, the beavers at a colony on the Bierstadt moraine were compelled to bring their winter supply of aspens the distance of a quarter of a mile from an isolated grove that had escaped the fire. This stood on a bench of the moraine at an altitude about 50 feet greater than that of the beaver pond. Aspens from the grove were dragged about 200 feet, then floated across a small waterhole, and from this taken up the steep slope of a ridge, then down to a point about 100 feet from the pond. Between this place and the pond was a deep wreckage of fire-killed and fallen spruces. To cut an avenue through these was too great a task for the beavers, so with much labor they dug a canal beneath the wide heap of wreckage, and through this, beneath the giant fallen trees, the harvested aspens were dragged and piled in the pond for winter food. The gathering of these harvests, even by beavers, must have been almost a hopeless task. In going thus far from water, many of the harvesters were exposed to their enemies, and it is probable that many beavers lost their lives. Beavers become strongly attached to localities, and especially to their homes. It is difficult to drive them away from these, but the exhaustion of the food supply sometimes compels an entire colony to abandon the old home site, migrate, and found a new colony. Some of the beavers' most audacious engineering works are undertaken for the purpose of maintaining the food supply of the colony. It occasionally happens that the food trees near the water by an old colony become scarce through excessive cutting, fires, or tree diseases. In cases of this kind, the colonists must go a long distance for their supplies or move. They prefer to stay at the old place and will work for weeks and brave dangers to be able to do this. They will build a dam, dig a new canal, clear a difficult right-of-way to a grove of food saplings, and then drag the harvest a long distance to the water, and now and then do all these for just one more harvest, one more year in the old home. The moraine colony had lost its former greatness. Instead of the several ponds and the 8 houses of which it had consisted 20 years before, only one house and a single pond remained. The house was in the deep water of the pond, about 20 feet above the dam. A vigorous brook from Chasm Lake, 3,000 feet above, ran through the pond and poured over the dam near the house. The colony was on a delta tongue of a moraine. Here it had been established for generations. It was embowered in a young pine forest and had ragged areas of willows around it. A fire and excessive cutting by beavers had left but few aspens near the water. These could furnish food for no more than 2 autumn harvests, and perhaps for only 1. Other colonies had met similar conditions. How would the moraine colony handle theirs? The moraine colonists mastered the situation in their place with the most audacious piece of work I have ever known beavers to plan and accomplish. About 130 feet south of the old pond was a grove of aspens. Between these and the pond was a small bouldery flat that had a scattering of dead and standing spruces and young lodgepole pines. A number of fallen spruces lay broken among the partly exposed boulders of the flat. One day I was astonished to find that a dam was being built across this flat, and still more astonished to discover that this dam was being made of heavy sections of fire-killed trees. Under necessity only will beavers gnaw dead wood, and then only to a limited extent. Such had been my observations for years, but here they were cutting dead, fire-hardened logs in a wholesale manner. Why were they cutting this dead wood, and why a dam across a rocky flat, a place across which water never flowed? A dam of dead timber across a dry flat appeared to be a marked combination of animal stupidity, but the beavers knew what they were doing. After watching their activities and the progress of the dam daily for a month, I realized that they were doing development work with the intention of procuring a food supply. They completed a dam of dead timber. At least 2 accidents happened to the builders of this deadwood dam. One of these occurred when a tree which the beavers had gnawed off pinned the beaver that had cut it between its end and another tree immediately behind the animal. The other accident was caused by a tree falling in an unexpected direction. This tree was leaning against a fallen one that was held several feet above the earth by a boulder. When cut off, instead of falling directly to the earth, it slid alongside the log against which it had been leaning and was shunted off to one side, falling upon and instantly killing 2 of the logging beavers. The dam, when completed, was 85 feet long. It was about 50 feet below the main pond and 60 feet distant from the south side of it. 50 feet of the new dam ran north and south, parallel to the old one. Then, forming a right angle, it extended 35 feet toward the east. It averaged 3 feet in height, being made almost entirely of large chunks, dead tree cuttings from 6 to 15 inches in diameter and from 2 to 12 feet long. It appeared a crude windrow of dead timber wreckage. The day it was completed, the builders shifted the scene of activity to the brook, a short distance below the point where it emerged from the main pond. Here they placed a small dam across it and commenced work on a canal through which they endeavored to lead a part of the waters of the brook into the reservoir which their deadwood dam had formed. There was a swell or slight rise in the earth of about 18 inches between the reservoir and the head of the canal that was to carry water into it. The swell, I suppose, was not considered by the beavers. At any rate, they completed about half the length of the canal, then apparently discovered that water would not flow through it in the direction desired. Other canal builders have made similar errors. The beavers were almost human. This part of the canal was abandoned and a new start made. The beavers now apparently tried to overcome the swell in the earth by an artificial work. A pondlet was formed immediately below the old pond by building a 60-foot bow-like dam, the ends of which were attached to the old dam. The brook pouring from the old pond quickly filled this new, narrow, 60-foot-long reservoir. The outlet of this was made over the Bow Dam at the point nearest to the waiting reservoir of the Deadwood Dam. The water, where it poured over the outlet of the Bow Dam, failed to flow toward the waiting reservoir, but was shed off to one side by the earth swell before it. Instead of flowing southward, it flowed eastward. The beavers remedied this and directed the flow by building a wing dam, which extended southward from the Bow Dam at the point where the water overpoured. This earthwork was about 15 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 2 high. Along the upper side of this the water flowed, and from its end a canal was dug to the reservoir. About half of the brook was diverted, and this amount of water covered the flat and formed a pond to the height of the Deadwood Dam in less than 3 days. Most of the leaky openings in this dam early became clogged with leaves, trash, and sediment that were carried in by the water, but here and there were large openings which the beavers mudded themselves. The new pond was a little more than 100 feet long and from 40 to 50 feet wide. Its southerly shore flooded into the edge of the aspen grove which the beavers were planning to harvest. The canal was from 4 to 5 feet wide and from 8 to 20 inches deep. The actual distance that lay between the brook and the shore of the new pond was 90 feet. Though the diverting of the water was a task, it required less labor than the building of the dam. With dead timber and the canal, the beavers had labored 2 seasons for the purpose of getting more supplies without abandoning the colony. If in building the dam they had used the green, easily cut aspens, they would have greatly reduced the available food supply. It would have required most of these aspens to build the dam. The only conclusion I can reach is that the beavers not only had the forethought to begin work to obtain a food supply that would be needed 2 years after, but also, at the expense of much labor, actually saved the scanty nearby food supply of aspens by making their dam with the hard, fire-killed trees. A large harvest of aspen and willow was gathered for the winter. Daily visits to the scene of the harvest enabled me to understand many of the methods and much of the work that otherwise would have gone on unknown to me. Early in the harvest, an aspen cluster far downstream was cut. Every tree in this cluster and every nearby aspen was felled, dragged to the brook, and in this, with wrestling, pushing, and pulling, taken upstream through shallow water, for most mountain streams are low during the autumn. In the midst of this work, the entrance or inlet of the canal was blocked and the Bow Dam was cut. The water in the brook was almost doubled in volume by the closing of the canal, thereby making the transportation of aspens upstream less laborious. When the downstream aspens at last reposed in a pile beside the house, harvesting was briskly begun in the aspens along the shore of the new pond. Then came another surprise. The Bow Dam was repaired, and the canal not only opened, but enlarged, so that almost all the water in the brook was diverted into the canal, through which it flowed into the new pond. The aspens cut on the shore of the new pond were floated across it, then dragged up the canal into the old pond. Evidently, the beavers not only had again turned the water into the canal that they might use it in transportation, but also had increased the original volume of water simply to make this transportation of the aspens as easy as possible. Their new works enabled the colonists to procure nearly 500 aspens for the winter. All these were taken up the new canal, dragged over the Bow and the main dams, and piled in the water by the house. In addition to these, the aspens brought from downstream made the total of the harvest 732 trees, and with these went several hundred small willows. Altogether, these made a large green brush pile that measured more than 100 feet in circumference, and after it settled, averaged 4 feet in depth. This was the food supply for the oncoming winter. The upper surface of this stood about 1 foot above the surface of the water. 5 years after the completion of this Deadwood Dam, it was so overgrown with willows and grass that the original material, the dead tree trunks that formed the major portion of it, was completely covered over. The new pond was used but one season. All the aspens that were made available by the dam of the pond were cut in one harvest. The place is now abandoned, old ponds and new.